I thought to myself, how does one cover 2,000 years in a 20-minute presentation and do it well? Surely I will leave out some significant moments or have some incorrect dates. So I apologize now if I skipped over your favorite artist or process. I'm a faculty member, as Megan mentioned, that teaches printmaking to undergraduate students. And for the last 24 years, I've had the privilege of doing that at the Cleveland Institute of Art. I'm also an artist who is consumed by the field, but I'm definitely not an art historian. I'm not sure how one pulls off an abbreviated version on the subject. Those who know me know I love to talk about all things print, so brevity and I are not friends. Before I get going, however, I thought in the spirit of the current archives exhibition, Handing It Down, featuring prints from the Jack and Linda Lissiar collection, it felt important to share my gratitude for the print knowledge passed down from my print faculty. My undergrad professor, Suzanne Chateau, who continues her role in the professor at Xavier University, I carry her phrase with me: if you're going to make a print, have some integrity while doing so. I was able to invite Suzanne to CIA recently, where she shared many of her reduction woodblock prints. And while there, she demonstrated the use of a Dremel as a mark-making tool for her relief work. And Sid Cross, Distinguished Professor of Graduate Studies at Clemson, not only a great influence within the print studio, but she introduced me to the professional networks of the Southern Graphics Print Council, now SGCI, and the Mid-America Print Council, or MAPC. While I was in grad school, Sid was the SGCI president, affording me the opportunity to travel to see a plethora of print exhibitions and introducing me to those I call the print legends of our time, faculty and established artists in the collegiate ranks. She impressed upon me a very important attribute of print, sharing knowledge with others through the instruction and collaboration. Sid co-taught a course with Dr. Elisa Sparks, something along the lines of Women in Print. I can't really remember the title, but I do remember those classroom discussions that ring true in my ears and the images that float in my mind as I recall those seminal readings. Women who have created works within the last 50 years, who push the boundaries of traditional printmaking, mixing media, expanding scale, and pushing up against the do it this way approach. Barbara Kruger, Nancy Spiro, Jenny Holzer, Dorothy Nappengardi, Kiki Smith, Jane Quick-to-See Smith, Leslie Dill, Kara Walker, and Lynn Allen, to name a few. I thank these two faculty for grounding me in this field and sharing the print histories I know. There is no one way to present a survey about printmaking. Much continues to be learned and revealed in documented histories. So what we know true is today, especially as it relates to early dates, is constantly in flux. Looking back throughout history books and other references, many sources offer a chronological approach to the field of print. Others move through time discussing process or technique, while others offer a lens through thematic movements. There are even some approaches that travel through time and regions, or even the evolution of the press, offering a glimpse of the artist studio in which a print was made. We could also consider a look through time like Warrington Colescott. From 1975 to 78, in a suite of 21 intaglio prints, 2 lithographs, and a handful of watercolors and drawings titled The History of Printmaking. In each print, Colescott started with a historical fact and then added his own interpretation, often borrowing from the featured artist's own style or themes, as seen here in this multicolor etching. So I offer a bit of a hybrid, a compilation of historical timeline with recent examples mixed in along the way. 2 phrases that I often share with my students when speaking about the history and current practice of print are matrix and dissemination. Historically speaking, a matrix is an object or the surface a print has been created from, sometimes referred to as the plate, the woodblock, the stone, or the screen. And since the advent of digital technology, the phrase matrix has also included Command P, referencing the digital file a print can be derived from. From these 2 images of Michael Kempson's work, we see the plate on the left, often the object talked about in the making process, and the print or the byproduct as the impression from that matrix. And dissemination, referring to the nuances of the function of a print. Understanding multiples, as we like to say, is where we find the distinction of the intent of that print. Was it made for commercial distribution from a publisher or a vendor, or maybe driven from an individual's artist interest? Or even still, possibly not commercially driven at all, but intended for mass distribution, open to all by various means. From this image capture of the Pace Edition website as an example of a publisher, slightly different than the understanding of a newspaper or book publisher, is one of the many print publishers around. Pace was founded in 1968 after the launch of the print renaissance to provide contemporary artists with resources and facilities to create and then exhibit fine art limited edition prints that move between these two arenas. So what does it mean to trace the development of the medium from its emergence? While we can point to early seals as printable surfaces dating prior to 3000 BC, this example shows both the stone cylinder matrix on the left and the clay imprint on the right. We can also note other forms like coins, pottery imprints, and cloth printing as early examples of printing. But for our purposes today, paper printing might be a good place to begin. While there is much back and forth regarding the first appearance of paper and where, or even the contents of the first all rag or the all plant-based paper, most agree the date of 105 AD is a landing date for the development in China. The first and second editions of The Invention of Print in China and its Spread Westward by Thomas Francis Carter and Carrington Goodrich trace the invention of paper, the pathways discovered, and the challenges negotiated as new artifacts have been found. I want to include a few images of paper making as it brings into light invention and the importance to print. Paper making was shared through China, then quickly to Japan and Korea, found its way to the Arab region, and was eventually shared with the Spaniards and Italians in the 13th century, almost as the same makeup that it was 5 centuries prior. The makeup of fibers, the improvements applied for strength, length, and ink absorption were all modifications made prior to the 8th century when the craft was passed on to other regions and before block printing from wood in the West. While we can land on the 2nd century to learn the practice of creating paper rubbings from stone carvings, a look from the Folk Museum in Xi'an, China, are early examples of narratives shared through images and carved stones. Carter also notes the desert air of Chinese Turkestan, like that of Egypt, has preserved uncovered artifacts that researchers from the British, French, German, Russian, and Japanese expeditions have made it possible to reconstruct the history of daily life in Western outposts of China. A large number of block prints and block books have been newly unearthed. While paperworks, manuscripts, and paintings can be found throughout East dating prior, it was the find of Sir Ariel Stein of the Diamond Sutra that carries an interesting note on the printed colophon or end page of the work. Translated, it was made reverently for the universal free distribution by Wang Chen on behalf of his 2 parents on the 15th of the 4th moon of the 9th year, begging the question of the beginning of the first notation of open source or possibly free copyright. Evidence of the woodblock printing appeared in Korea and Japan soon afterward. The Great Tahari Sutra was discovered in South Korea in 1966, but dated between 704 and 751. Another sutra printed in Japan around 770. We know that 1 million copies of the sutra, along with other prayers, were ordered by the then empress. As a theme of practice of printmaking, a new method does not replace a previous one, but rather adds to what is already present. The practice of stone carving and printing continued in sharing the Confucian classics. In the Xi'an forest of the stone steels, this practice continues today. So the timeline of woodblock carving and printing is long. It can help us also trace the populance of the book form. It is hard to separate these two. Woodblock printing changed the shape and structure of books. Pieces of wood being more lightweight and mobile often influenced the spread of practice. Scrolls were gradually replaced by concertina bindings, accordions or whirlwind, for the ease of private reading and flipping pages. Around the year 1000, butterfly binding was also developed. Woodblock prints allowed 2 mirror images to be easily replicated on a single sheet. Thus, 2 pages were printed at one time in a sheet and then folded inwards and then bound. While we could jump to Gutenberg for the discussion of movable type, it would be important to note China saw clay and ceramic movable type as early as 1040 and metal in the 1200s. Also, 1377, printed in Korea, is the oldest book known printed using metal movable type. Gutenberg is recognized as inventing the movable type printing press. Gutenberg adopted the basic screw press design, thereby mechanizing a printing process. To speed things up, he introduced the movable undertable with a plain surface in which the sheets could be swiftly changed in and out. This revolutionized the print industry, not only for books in regards to type, but image-based works and developed new processes. From that point, printing methods and printing presses spread rapidly throughout Europe first, and then to the rest of the world. As we move on to talk about relief works, it may be important to note some tools. These two photographs represent tools today. On the top right, considered as palm tools where you push away from your body through the materials. And the central image, a combination of tools, and some may recognize McLean's in here, Eastern practices with shortcuts that move towards your body. Images pulled from Donald Saff printmaking process show the difference of location of the carving of wood. Wood engraving, using the end grain for hardness and detail, often includes several pieces of wood put together to make a larger image area, while the wood cut uses the plank of the wood as seen as the image on the left. We learned from Ann Coffin, the director of International Print Center in New York in 2000, for the inaugural exhibition. She states, the practice of print in the West began in earnest around 1400, coinciding with the introduction of Europe to the technologies for making paper and early demand for large numbers of readily produced images for both leisure and devotional practices. When paper became more easily available around 1400, the medium transferred very quickly to small woodcuts, religious image and playing cards printed on paper. These prints were produced in very large numbers from about 1425 on. Playing cards, some like to extend the concept of self-promotion in relationship to the early form of the business card, were produced as both woodcuts and then later hand-colored, and then produced from metal as seen from the image on the right where the marks were carved deeply into copper. Albrecht Dürer, where we consider cross-hatching to appear in 1490, was prolific in the production of woodcuts and eventually even metal engravings. While it's understood Dürer had access to a print studio, the image on the right leans further into subject matter. As the story goes, in 1515, Dürer did not see a rhinoceros, but created the image, then the woodcut, as translated from the information passed on to him. And a contemporary of Dürer's, Titian, in 1514, in the submersion of the Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea, is where we start to see looser drawing and carving styles that gave way for effect. The late 15th century brings us to intaglio, a group of techniques in which the image is incised into the matrix by hand, etchants, and then eventually photographic processes. The ink is then pulled out of the image area and onto paper using a press, sometimes understood to be the inverse of relief, where the image is pulled from the remaining uncut portions that have been inked. In 1470, we start to see engraved works from Schonengauer, the son of a goldsmith, and Dürer, and learn the apprentice model in the division of labor in the studios. This influence can also be seen in the woodcuts in the West, for instances in the work of Hans Holbein, who known for his drawing style for the woodcut series Dance of the Death. These tiny wooden blocks were no bigger than 4 postage stamps put together in a rectangle. 41 blocks in total were cut by Hans Leutenberger, a frequent and highly skilled collaborator of Holbein's, reminding us of the shared nature of the artist and printer, not always one and the same person. While functionality of prints ebb and flow between practical function, i.e. this case maps, connections between intaglio printmakers and metal work trade continued in the 1600s to the 1700s. Boss's 1645 treaty, The Art of Intaglio by Means of Hard and Soft Grounds, is a movement away from the use of the burin for engraving towards new tools and approaches in intaglio. Here we see tools and plates for intaglio, a mezzotint rocker, roulette wheel, needle, scraper, burnisher, and we also know through time various metals have been used: copper, brass, iron, tin, lead, steel, zinc, and more recently, aluminum sheets for the inventive approaches of intaglio. Collet is notable for standardizing hard ground etching and for its invention of the needle. He is also noted to have tonal ranges produced for multiple bitings, meaning the plates were put in and out of the acid multiple times to create tone and depth. It is understood Rembrandt did not travel. However, print works and materials did arrive in Amsterdam. By 1650, Rembrandt was already a prolific and able etcher and took the radical approach of reworking plates with dry point and printing as what is described as states, often spanning many years between iteration and iteration. We also know Rembrandt worked with selective hand wiping for the effects and moods, along with various types of papers from 1653 to 1660. Rembrandt's plates were reworked and printed long after his passing. This notion gives rise to the question, what is the edition? Who is the author? We might be familiar with the relief form of ukiyo-e, a genre of painting and printmaking that developed in the late 17th century Japan. This later work from 1830, The Great Wave, is understood that about 1,000 copies were initially printed, and later iterations show much wear. In total, it is estimated approximately 8,000 copies were eventually printed. Throughout the 1700s, tonal investigations were pursued in several intaglio processes. Mezzotints had rise in the early decade, while aquatints came a little bit later. In these two works by Goya, the image of the Los Caprichos in 1799 presented having larger clumps of rosin in the tonal shifts, while later works benefit from the refined rosin to capture a softer and more watercolor-like transition in the value range. It is not until the year 1798, however, that lithography is invented by Bavarian author Alois Senefelder to expedite the production of sheet music, and eventually makes its way into the artist practice 30 years later. The photo on the right is of two lithographic stones, one having markings of banknotes and letterheads, while the one on the right contains a figural image. 1820 is when artists started using lithography for artistic practices, right around the time period when photography emerged and the printing arena pushed towards new approaches and commercial function. Between 1830 and 1835, French censorship laws had been suspended, allowing stone litho works to appear in periodicals from artists like Daumier, one of the most accomplished and prolific lithographers in the 19th century, who often provided characters criticizing contemporary political abuses or satirizing French society. His range and value with lithography is immeasurable, both in drawing and impression quality. We know that linoleum was developed around 1860 for flooring and 30 years later for wallpaper, as seen here from William Morris. Carved and printed as a relief surface, we would eventually see artists like Picasso using linoleum to create multicolor layered relief works as one of the many processes he explored. Artists also explored processes that were shorter lived. Zincography, as an example used by Gauguin in the late 1800s. I'm not sure if it was the ease of transporting thinner sheets of metal as he traveled, or if it was the influence of the printer or artist to make the decision of what process to select. Zincography is printed like a lithostone, but as the name suggests, the drawing on metal, particularly zinc, is a departure from stones. Steel facing and electroplating copper for larger runs of engraving show up in the late 19th century and certainly influenced paper currency, while the invention and influence of photography showed up in photogravures around 1880. Rapid development of photographic transfer techniques to the printing matrix revolutionized the print industry. It also prompted a re-emphasis on the craft of printmaking, spawning the etching revival for fine art print distribution. 19th century France is when the concept of the limited edition was conceived and promoted, along with the cancellation plates to prove or capture the number of the individual works. Signing prints, also 19th century phenomenon, promoted the value of the artist's signature on said work. The term chromolithography covers various types of lithography that are printed in color. This image produced by New York founded Currier and Ives is as a one-layer print with hand coloring would predate the evolution of key plate printed in black and the subsequent layers printed in CMYK fashion. Artists like Lautrec worked in many approaches and multi-layer lithographs, both for personal and poster-based work. Offset printing became a widely used printing technique where the ink image is transferred or offset from the plate to a rubber blanket and then to the printing surface. Offset works like Liechtenstein grew in favor for quicker runs of larger scaled work without working in the reverse. While the Works Progress Administration influenced lithographic work in the US in the 1930s, it is unclear to me how Kollwitz produced lithographic works while calling attention for aid and humanitarianism during the war. Screen print in its modern form is noted around 1907. While we've already talked about screen printing and earlier silkscreen methods arriving from stenciling, photo-based screen print, larger stones, and coding photo emulsion right to the stones was in favor and experimentation of Rauschenberg, but not before some resistance. In 1960s, when he was invited to create prints, lithographs specifically, he posed the question, why would anyone at this time want to draw on rocks? He would go on to be extremely prolific in lithographic and screen print works, and would influence print media beyond the US borders with the Rauschenberg Overseas Cultural International Exchange Program, sponsoring artists from other countries to take up and produce printed works. The print renaissance in the early 60s saw the rise of the print studios to support artists in research and development of print-based works. While there are many, Tatiana Grossman of ULE, Catherine Brown of Crown Point Press, and June Wayne of Tamron come to mind as leaders in the movement. Early on, artists like Frankenthaler and Dine created works in the spirit of collaboration between artists and printers, and many more artists using a variety of processes and altering the way in which prints are understood in the large-scale context of an artist's overall body of work. We see rapid movements in artists borrowing from commercial print inventions to push up against the always challenging question, what is a print? Processes using photocopiers and laser printers and flexography offered experimental surface and means for artist production. A version of the flexible plate is a photopolymer or plastic-coated light-sensitive sheet that can be used for photo-based intaglio process, as seen here. Joe considers the thin, strong Eastern paper fibers to be the most desirable for detail when pulling a photopolymer image. This gets us all the way to digital prints, and I'm sure Michael will share a bit more here. But digital, or direct from the computer file to substrate, reestablishes the CMYK print. While arguments have been made for artists in relationships to new media, such as in essays like Ruth Weisberg's Syntax of Print and Joanna Drucker Violating Protocols, we see artists like Randy Bolton mixing lines and presenting work that can live in both conversations. But artists are embracing newer technologies like 3D printers, CNC, and laser cutters to incorporate ways of making. I'd like to conclude with the work of Laurie Gibbons, professor of the University of North Texas School of Art and Design. She was the recent presenter at the MAPC conference here in Northeast Ohio in the fall. This image shows the CNC machine adaptation and adding a needle tool to the driver for drawing on copper. While this image shows the puzzle piece of the laser cut relief block, inventive ways to make a matrix to make a print. And Joseph Shearer, who continues his international travel and public presentations to share knowledge of the print field. This last slide is the one of an interactive map found on the New York Center Prints webpage. A recent request went out to add your print shop to the platform as a way to connect and share. As in the spirit of printmaking, while a shop is not always necessary to make a print, often the nuances learned from others is the valuable and important thing to pass along. What a better way to do this than to make a transparent and open platform to share your next stop.
Wow, I think we just made it through 2,000 years of history. That was pretty impressive. Just
Thanks.
Wonderful.
And I was hoping along the way it made it. Okay.
Yeah, no, it did. And we did have a request. The program will be recorded, and then we had a request that the slides would maybe be available. So I'll talk to Maggie about that after the fact. Oh, I got a nod, so that'll be the case.
No problem.
So now that we have arrived in the present moment, here we are. We're going to kick things over to Michael to talk about their practice, their digital integrations with traditional printmaking technology, and all of the things they accomplish with this medium. So Michael, if you're ready, kick it away to part two.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to Mindy Tousley, Megan Alves. Let me just try to get this slideshow started. Thanks to Maggie Denk-Leigh and the Artist Archives of the Western Reserve for the invitation to be here with you all today. Can you all hear me okay? Okay,
Yeah,
great.
perfect.
Okay, I prepared a lecture for us to think more creatively on what new technologies can provide for artists and their toolboxes, and subsequently what lies ahead for the arts in the immediate future. Beyond AI's decentralized, privatized corporate products, beyond unimaginative and capitalist motivated NFTs, and beyond cringe fringe novelties that reproduce and recirculate harmful ideas that further naturalize artificial borders, essentially gentrifying our collective and individual imaginations toward. I grew up and am based in San Antonio, Texas, originally known as the land of Yanaguana. Since the European occupation of the Americas, this region has been replaced by 6 evolutions of white supremacy under the 6 flags shown on this slide. We are a majority Hispanic population, and there remains a pervasive cultural politics of assimilation into Anglo homogeneity that correlates with Texas's identity as an anti-Mexican state. Growing up in this environment, I spent a great deal of my childhood playing video games on arcade machines in the 80s and 90s, and that's me and my 2 brothers at the local arcade in San Antonio. A lot of these games featured hyper-patriotic themes marketed to young male gamers, promoting vigilante violence in the name of the war on drugs, centering pale male protagonists against perceived racialized threats. These games bolstered violent imagery, sexually suggestive themes, and colonial fantasies, and even today, this is the formula that thrives in today's gaming culture, only with greater distribution power provided by online collaborative and competitive gameplay. This formula is also the ideological violence work that Hollywood propaganda has relied heavily on to further naturalize hierarchies of social power that have been constructed over centuries to privilege those with European genealogy. And if you look at what major movie studios are producing today, you'll find that very little has changed. Colorism has a long history in the Americas, beginning with the European invasion to the New World in the 15th century. During the Spanish conquest of the Americas, Spanish DNA intermixed with indigenous American or Amerindian, along with African DNA, to produce an entirely new race of people, or mestizaje, that reflected the entirety of humankind. To keep themselves as the elite social class, the Spanish enacted the caste system, which classified all the combinations of the racial mixings of in the Americas, primarily based on a hierarchy of skin color and facial features. And this image shows a taxonomical gridding of different castes according to the Spanish crown. And it's notable that the US adopted this same racial logic and still maintains this primitive social model. This is some of my early graphic design work as a student at San Antonio College from about 20 years ago. I maintained a daily drawing practice since then of vector-based digital illustration and did so until enrolling as a BFA student at Texas State University. And I got to a point where I was able to make any visual that I wanted, and I was thirsty at that point to produce imagery with cultural and social meaning. And at this school, it's where I became aware of my sense of cultural alienation from my Mexican heritage and my assimilation into the dominant narrative of colorblind racism, because it was here that I experienced increased moments of racialization and minoritization. As a means of expressing a mixed set of emotions, ideologies, and histories affecting my perception of self, I sought to create a lexicon that would codify my lived experience as an index of composite digital patterns, glyphs, figures, and symbols evoking the energy of the Mixtec manuscripts of the 15th century. This was the first screen print that I did featuring the now somewhat famous Mustache Cat. It was designed in Adobe Illustrator, and each layer was exposed and printed on a large 26 by 40-inch sheet of French paper. This would become my breakthrough series of prints called the Codex Migratis, and that's me in the print studio at Texas State working in large scale. I have to give a shout out to Jeff Dell for allowing me to take advantage of the studio even after graduating from the program to continue building on this portfolio. Here's a picture of the prints drawing in the studio. And similarly, I sought to preserve significant events affecting me and the greater Latinx community as allegorical, digitally rendered imagery that would allow for multiple interpretations by viewers without access to my intended meanings. I turned to these codices as a generative model to express my racial awakening in pictographic terms, connecting my practice of precision digital drawing with ancient American expression. Since 2010, I have amassed thousands of vector-based drawings using what I now know as functioning using algorithms embedded in Adobe Illustrator. It's referred to as generative AI drawing. And so what I did was codify landscape descriptions, and I was able to apply these generative AI drawn patterns that were Mishtek inspired into digital radiuses and different types of original character drawings that really fused a lot of my influences growing up in South Texas. So these drawings have been translated into mediums from everything from screen prints to digital prints, paintings, digital animations, and new media installation environments, recalling the hyperbolic gridded pictures of the ancient Mexican codices. At RISD, I learned to animate from my digital codex files, and this is an example of how I went about animating my digital codex files. I got to experiment with making video sculptures that would have video monitors embedded, and I got to decorate around to create original frames for these pieces. I also got to experiment with early virtual reality technology that RISD afforded me. At that time, I was interested in creating a VR headset that one could wear with a mask attachment and perform to third-party onlookers and present this experience as a kind of psychedelic digital installation to connect my Mexican heritage to those of the global South in Sri Lanka specifically, after having the opportunity to study abroad during my time at RISD. What I was most interested in these early VR experiments was the reverence of the virtual by the performer that correlated to that of a shamanistic ritual performance, and how access was only granted to one person at a time while others watched in awe. This is something that I can continue to be interested in and will return to in upcoming work. This is student work related to my printmaking thesis at RISD, and this is the final MFA thesis installation titled Neo-Chicano Vista, which attempted to recreate a virtual installation environment with 5 channels of video animations, one being a dedicated projection mapped animation, creating a disorienting effect, giving the illusion that the room is slowly moving. And here's an installation from 2018 at the McNay Museum in San Antonio, Texas. This was a print installation where I covered all the square footage of the gallery walls with a repeat pattern that was screen printed onto butcher paper, along with the columns being decorated with digital print that was made into vinyl and wrapped around the individual columns. And what ended up happening was once the entirety of the wall space was covered with these prints, it created a space that mimicked 64-bit graphic video game environments like the Nintendo 64 era of video games that I grew up adoring and being highly influenced by. So that was kind of a plus for me, is to see a potential in creating environments that utilize printmaking, but for creating a different kind of effect than just a revered work hanging on the wall. So this is an image from the Fine Arts Work Center fellowship that I did in 2015 through 16. The exhibition included video sculptures that I made throughout the residency, including an interactive video game reinterpretation of the goddess Mayahuel. Another example of a video sculpture. And then I continued making after RISD 2016, 2017. I started making images that the historian Paul Ortiz refers to as emancipatory or having a reverence to emancipatory internationalism, which is to express the idea that if my neighbor is not free, then I'm not free. And this is the founding principle of coalition building against white supremacy. Around this time, 2016, I began incorporating narrative imagery addressing the concerns of the Black community as a means of expressing co-ethnic solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. This is a screenshot of what my drawing files look like while they're in production. in Adobe Illustrator using multiple artboards and then having the in-between spots being like a sketchbook that continues to build until I get to the final image, which then gets translated into a print. This print was an etching, one of the only etchings that I've ever made. I primarily work as designing images for screen print to translate from digital to screen. In this case, we were translating from digital to a printed halftone, and then those halftone dots got etched into a copper plate by Jill Lerner, who was the master printer at the Joe Segura studio located at Notre Dame. And we also worked using a laser machine CNC router. And so I designed a woodblock print that would translate a digital image to wood. And so that was, for me, a novel approach to create a digital work for a woodcut. So I've continued to redraw elements from arcade games such as user interface designs, character designs, and motion graphic properties as vector graphics that approximate the visual density of the ancient pre-Columbian manuscripts as a way of conflating ancient American pictographs with the ongoing gamification of racialized oppression. The first time I printed from a digital file onto Hanemule paper was when I worked with a local printer in San Antonio called Hare and Hound Press. And they printed a digital image that I made, a very colorful one from a series called Enter the Border, using a large format Epson printer. And for me, that indicated that having a greater budget could potentially lead to an almost exclusive computer-based practice from conception to materialization. As I continue to research the interwoven histories of European colonization, US slavery, mass incarceration, and the increasing socio-technical deployment of online surveillance and predictive policing software, it has become apparent for me to represent these shared histories as interactive experiences using digital technology in order to subvert their colonial agency. Within the context of an art exhibition or through a public intervention, I'm searching for ways to amplify abolitionist content through the co-optation of Silicon Valley gadgets and digital advertising practices with the intention of disrupting the economic logic of American racial capitalism. I characterize our current conditions as a neocolonial digital caste system, a high-tech evolution of white supremacy operating through the invisible digital architecture that permeates our daily lives. In this way, the cultural genocide of previous generations continues to flourish unnoticed. And this is a print series titled La Raza Cosmica 20XX, printed in collaboration with Julia Samuels at Overpass Projects, located in Providence, Rhode Island. Julia is a fellow printmaker from my grad cohort at RISD, and we worked really hard on this series in 2019, and hopefully we will continue to create another, a part 2 follow-up to this series of prints. But essentially, it's my reinvention or our reinvention of the casta painting tradition of the Spanish colonial Mexico, depicting the various racial combinations as family portraits in the Americas. And these family pairings are surrounded by big tech pictograms to suggest their technological colonization. Here's a quick screenshot of how I'm planning to move the series forward with La Raza Cosmica 20XX 2.0. And these are some digital prints that have made their way to being outputted as digital prints from digital files. And this is a digital print that was on display at NYU's the Latinx Project. And I'll close by reading from an essay I wrote for the spring edition of the Brooklyn Rail last year titled The Print Matrix Has You. Printmaking and capitalism, a marriage made in heaven, yet a double-edged sword for many artists, emerging or seasoned. On one hand, printmakers gain the psychological and physical benefits of manual labor and the accompanying endorphins emphasizing collaboration and community building with peers, IRL, hopefully, but not limited to, disengaging from their digital screens. By committing their attention to a print matrix, printmakers are rewarded with a beautiful series of multiples on the surface of their choosing. On the other hand, this kind of practice easily surrenders itself to colonial values of production that emphasize maximizing material goods in as little time as possible for the greatest financial return possible. This mindset can very easily place the printmaker in a position to have their creative labor stunted, their spirit consumed by a capitalist chilling effect that has them attempting to prioritize the precarious demands of the art market over their own creative expression. Even if one finds a kind of print production that is satisfying to the creative soul, one still has to commit oneself to exhibiting the fruits of their labor with the hope of gaining recognition from an art world of endless social comparison anxiety. If they have not fully developed an understanding of their role in society, this leaves the printmaker vulnerable to exploitation or in an otherwise easily commodifiable position at the hands of powerful predatory capitalists, of which there are plenty in elite art circles. As printmakers, it's imperative to acknowledge these sometimes dueling aspects of our growing practice. Like any other industry dealing in multiples, printmakers have to confront the following questions. Do you prioritize quantity over quality over quantity, or perhaps you subscribe to an ethos of a higher calling, making art for art's sake? In any case, every printmaker will have to answer the dreaded question. What's the point of producing multiples using ancient print technology? This analysis begs the question, if printmaking is so closely tied to capitalist modes of production, can't we use printmaking to redefine capitalist modes of consumption? Printmaking is in dire need of rebranding. It's an activity that need not be relegated to ancient world techniques that materialize onto rectangular objects that hang inside frames and inside the loftiest of buildings. Printmakers, print collectors, and print curators, I urge you to think more liberally about the definition of a print and of printmaking in general. Remember movie theaters, when we used to stare hours at a time at an impression of light onto the surface of a large screen? Guess what? That was printmaking, in action. Let's redefine our collective understanding of what printmaking is and what it can be. We are living through an industrial revolution that has brought with it innovative possibilities for printmakers of all kinds, from all generations, to express themselves through digital matrices. We're an earshot away from augmented reality and virtual reality print collections at our aging art institutions, if we can only agree that these technologies have print potential written all over them. Let's go back to a basic definition of print. Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines print as a transitive verb, quote, to impress a pattern or design onto something, end quote. Take your pick. There are countless ways to make impressions these days, particularly with a concentrated light or shadow show. And with consumer holographic technology on the rise, we would be remiss to discredit the validity of a holographic print as anything but a kind of print technology deserving of a spot in the art market. Let's talk print editioning. In order to quantify more abstract printed editions, one would have to include more contextual information, possibly in the way of metadata, as boundaries for printed information are redefined. Printmakers, we live in a capitalist society, yes, and I urge you to take notice of what capitalism asks from artists, and from printmaking in particular. Are you feeling the pressure to constantly produce material objects that can be converted into commodities that enter into the art market? Do you ever question where this pressure comes from? What happens if you abandon the print studio? Does this signal the end of your career as an artist? If you're like me, you've invested a lot of capital into your career as an artist, and maybe paid tuition to gain access to institutional resources, such as a printmaking studio. You've convinced yourself that a return on your investment in your education must materialize into a body of work, a suite of prints, or an NFT that can be exchanged for some kind of real-world profit that you can then share on any number of commercial platforms you may be tethered to and have committed your life to monitoring. I digress. The institutionalization of printmaking needs to evolve, as does our understanding of what a print matrix is. The way we value art needs to be reinvented. Let's complicate this rich practice we call printmaking. Take the red pill. Challenge how we classify prints. You already know what you have to do. Thank you.
That's amazing. Michael, thank you for this amazing presentation that is thought-provoking in so many ways. I'm going to rewatch the recording of this, which will be available to digest both what you and Maggie said over and over again. So I'm really grateful to both of you for these presentations. So, and this is a great thing. We have time for a conversation and a dialogue. A lot of ideas were put out there. So if anybody is interested in question, a comment for either Michael or Maggie, you have two ways of doing that. You can raise your hand, and then you can speak something out loud, even if it's to say you like what you saw, or maybe you didn't. That's great too. Or you can type a question in the Q&A and we'll read it out loud. So if anybody, brave soul, would like to go. And there's also the ability that, of course, if anyone at our end, whether that's Maggie or Kelly or Mindy, who are all printmakers, if you have anything of interest, you're welcome to jump on as well to get that as a communal thing. So I can see my executive director's wheels working, and she's smiling as the thing.
I probably have like a million questions, and I'm sort of dumbfounded also. Michael, your practice is amazing.
Thank you. Appreciate
Yeah.
you.
So, how do we subvert capitalism as printmakers? Like, how do you do that? I mean, I feel like all of the means and methods at our disposal, including augmented reality and everything, are just like part of the system. So how do you do that? How do you subvert it? What do we just put it in the hands of everyone? Is that it? I mean, is that it?
I mean, I wrote that essay to instigate for artists to attempt to answer it in their own way, whatever means they have available to them. And for me, like, I come from a lower socioeconomic background, so I consider myself to be what Joseph E. or I forget who wrote this theory of being doubly disadvantaged, of having like some privileges, social privileges of having gone through higher educational institutions and having social networks tied to those institutions, but then not having the economic means of maintaining a practice that continues to keep up to date with the latest technology, at least not in an easy way. You know, it's always a transgression for me to try to get the latest get my foot in the door in the latest augmented reality app or what have you. But I think everyone has to come with it with a new way to challenge the previous generation's methods of producing art that is already acceptable. So that's why I'm really critical of NFT culture, crypto culture, blockchain technology, and this idea of privatizing and commercializing everything into a corporate friendly package. For me, that's not exciting. I don't see people of color being excited about that, primarily because we are somewhat classed out of that discussion because it continues to be an elite 1% interest, and so that's why I want to challenge how we classify what a print is and who has access to challenging that. And I don't have the answers, but I'd like to throw those questions out there.
That is actually really wonderful. We've had programs kind of investigating NFTs too, and it's interesting how all these technologies hold hands and ask questions of the next technology that we keep speaking of, and the no easy answer too. So I actually have a question in the chat for you, Michael, which is, Michael, how do you feel about your prints being consumed / collected by major institutions and collectors?
I love being collected. It's how I maintain my well-being. I need income, and I feel that the work is deserving of that institutional appreciation and attention. I don't put myself enough out there because I have turned my back against social media companies. I don't agree with, and now the Surgeon General has backed up this position that I've had that has been a very unpopular position up until last month. I would say that these are not healthy technologies, and for me, they're not personally fruitful for developing ideas that transgress or challenge the status quo. If anything, they perpetuate and hone in on the status quo, and I have no interest in being commercially commodified by those tech partnerships. And I embrace being collected in those institutions because I get to be, my presence is a challenge to the usual suspects of pale male masters of the arts. And so just existing, taking up intellectual space for me is like a win. So yeah.
And that's a really like great practice. One of the things on Michael's website, which we'll make sure to put those links out there in the chat, is the fact that yes, there are no social media links there. Oh my God, how can we exist? But it's true, and I really appreciate that sort of really standing and practicing what you preach there, because yeah, it's not folks in the audience, it's not just faking it, it's actually a resistance against that. I saw Kelly Pontoni with a finger of question.
No, Augusto has his hand raised, so you might
Oh,
wanna...
thank you very much. Let me do that, and then I see another one. So one of our archived artists. Okay. Augusto, you should be able to unmute yourself at this time.
Yeah, I
Here we go.
did. I did. Okay, so Michael, love your work. I'm trying to put together right now as we speak. I'm trying to put together a print studio, and I've been debating different kind of final output. You know, if it is digital or silk screen or just a normal press. But I'm leaning towards digital, but I'm fighting the idea of how I'm going to limit the final run, and you were saying that it would be how to use like meta tags and things like that, and that I just to limit that. But have you thought about that process a little bit more?
Yeah, as I've briefly mentioned, that I've been researching the like big tech industry for 5 years now, and I've attended some conferences, and I've learned that holographic technology is becoming more commercially viable, and that the data storage is now moving towards light being encapsulated within holograms. And so I think if we consider that, like the potential of lights, like of light impressions to be one way of archiving or cataloging information, that's one way of creating a new edition that literally sheds new light on our art institutions. So that for me is appealing. I don't have the complete understanding of what that looks like, because it's very novel, and it's very it sounds really interesting for me. But as like artist, I have the ability to limit and put a cap on whatever I make. And so I give myself that ability to say, this is the edition. And let's say like a projection, like I'm only going to edition 5, projectors or short throw projectors that have this file attached to them. And there's your edition. So I think artists need to reclaim more of the power that we have historically been, has been weathered away from us. And so I want to advocate for individual artist autonomy again, and have retake some of our creative, decision making, and not try to appease institutions where we're at now, and try to like be more forward thinking, and just complicate things, like I was saying earlier in the essay.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting.
Also, another one in the chat as well. From one of our attendees, Michael, we have aside from recognizing and rejecting capitalism, colonialism, and racism, all of which is commendable, what political philosophy do you subscribe to as an alternative construction of society? Interesting. So we're getting a lot of like, if not this, then that questions, which
I think just retaining the ability of an artist to be mysterious, and having our role in society be one that is that continues to surprise. And I think we've lost the element of surprise the more we've become commercialized and co-opted by corporations' interests and political interests. So I've reveled in being unpopular, of being socially distant, because I get the element of surprise. I get to have some kind of mystery attached to my name. And I don't see that as a liability anymore like I used to. And now I see that as an asset and as an extension of my social practice. And hopefully that empowers other artists to do the same, to reject, unsubscribe, to delete your accounts, because they're not helping. You know, it's one thing to have an online portfolio, but it's quite another to only be thinking in terms of making things for the gram. And I found myself doing that around about 5 years ago, and I decided that's not something I value in my life and in my career as an artist. That's not the legacy I want to lead. So I've had to write a lot about it and read up on what's the economic logic behind the art market. It's racial capitalism. And so I've had to challenge a lot of things and therefore become unpopular, which, like I said, is an asset. It's not a liability.
I love that your willingness to ask questions and not necessarily have the answers for them, which I think is such an important practice in art too, which is challenge and bringing up alternative things. So though it would be pretty nifty if you're like, here's the entire alternative system, you know, you're like, but the role of artist isn't necessarily solving anything. Sometimes it is raising awareness about other things to work. And actually, speaking of technology and sort of the interplay of new technology, Joe Van Kerkhoff, who is actually a part of Saga, which is fantastic, asked, do you see AI playing any role in your work? Yeah, we would love your thoughts on that.
In my work, yes, I mentioned that Adobe Illustrator, I have apparently been working with AI, generative AI drawing, using the symbols library, the pattern the pattern brushes that I've made inspired by the Mixtec codices. Those have all been me applying a generative AI approach to drawing. So I've unknowingly been utilizing AI for 20 years now. When I began using Illustrator in 2003, I started building a codex, what I refer to as a digital codex. So I've already been using AI, but I'm not interested in chatbots deciding, you know, how to regulate my emotional well-being, or having any of those kinds of like colonial mind or colonial ideas of what the imagination, you know, can do. If anything, I'm critical of the recent commercialization by OpenAI and GPT-4 technology, and how the overhyping that the company is doing to the own things. Like, this is not it's disruptive in some ways, but artists are not. There should be no threat to any individual artist's practice by these things. That is a marketing myth, and I want to put that out there in this conversation, that we should be cynical when we hear of like what's called generative AI, of like Terminators taking over, you know, like a GPT 1000, I like to call it, you know, making Picasso-esque artworks. And even if they try to emulate what I do in my practice, it's not done by me. So I don't feel threatened by that technology taking over or replicating what I've done, because I have my own brain. So yeah, it's not as threatening as most people would like you to think.
And also, I just wanted to say that Joe is from EVAC. Yes, yes.
I did
EVAC.
say Saga. I am so sorry, Joe.
That's okay.
I even talked about your program in the beginning. I know, though, you're being kind and forgiving me digitally. I can feel it. So thank you for that. So also thank you for Kelly Pontoni, always actually having the right information. So yeah. So Michael, especially thank you for the AI comment. We've recently also had programs that explored it, and exactly, there's a huge debate, and it is actually really, it's wonderful to hear an artist that a different interpretation of that too, because many do feel threatened. So it's good to broaden the perspective and hear other perspectives there too. So we have just a couple minutes left. I know everybody is like digesting this at full speed, but does anybody else have any comments or questions for Michael or for Maggie whose amazing presentation we're still digesting.
I just wanted to say thank you to both of you. That was great. Really, really great. So much information. I feel like I could watch it 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
And I think coming from the archives, we have talked about this before, like, where is this going to go as far as archiving some of this stuff for the future?
Yeah.
And how will we do that? And what will that look like? So thank you both.
I had one closed question for Maggie, just because I wanted to do one. Maggie, if there was one regret you have, or one thing you couldn't put in your amazing Blitzkrieg presentation, which I'm going to watch as an art historian again to get my print nuancing, because I could feel where my knowledge lacked in places. Was there one thing that you wish you could have shoehorned in there that you didn't get, that you're like, oh gosh?
No, I mean, yes, like 200 other slides. I mean, I don't know, like that it's impossible to put it all in there. But I will say, I do have the luxury of working at a school that is constantly pushing up against new technologies. And it is pretty exciting to always have students from all sorts of disciplines blurring lines, right? And moving back and forth between their practice. And I think we're at a moment where, just as student-based, they're questioning, right, what is their future? What is their work production look like? And how do they wear the multiple hats that artists kind of have always worn? So it is an interesting time. And I think that, I think this presentation is going all the way back to, I know that you're in a series of programming, regarding new media, to kind of bookend some things in terms of where the artist's decision or where the artist's intent is. And I think, Michael, you were just speaking to that, right? Like, it's not a moment of being threatened. It's a moment of embracing whatever that is in the creative spirit or the creative inquiry that an artist may have.
Yeah, I wanted to add also that I have also been playing with Midjourney to create new sketches for print ideas. So that's a more like novel use of AI in my practice that has developed in the past year, is seeing the possibilities of and the limits of an AI powered text to image generator. But I quickly see it as a colossal waste of my time in the studio, and that's also part of the commercial appeal of it, is that it gets you to waste so much time and maybe possibly depend on it to create your own images. So after a while, you start to see it for what it is. It's just another tool, just like any other.
Well, that seems like the perfect wrap up. I'm going to, again, watch this a million times over and over again. I put links to Michael's website and to Maggie's website in the chat. They're also available on artistarchives.org, the same page that you got the program. And we'll do have a recording of the program available within a week, so you can watch it over and over and over again and send it to your print people and your non-print people to tell them. So, but I'd love to end the program with a huge round. First off, a thank you to Kelly for running tech today. Thank you so much for being here. Mindy for thinking of doing this whole program series, and most importantly to our presenters for doing an amazing job. So thank you so much all for being here. And yes, look forward to re-recording. And thank you, Michael and everyone. We will see you on the flip side.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
I'm gonna share my screen one more time.
Yes, yes. That will send us on home.
Do your surveys.
There we go. Yeah, so if anybody wants any more information on the archives, please do visit, and don't forget to take the survey. Michael, thank you so much. I'm gonna have to watch this like 3 or 4 times, I think. Maggie, thanks so much. I can't believe you crammed all that history into a little over a half an hour. It was pretty amazing. Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.